The ship moved slowly through the dark. It had been traveling for 9 months, and the crew was used to the silence by now. Outside the wide observation windows, there was nothing but black space and distant stars that looked like cold, white dust. The vessel was called the Ironclad Dawn, and it was not a warship. It was an exploration ship, but it had thick walls, strong engines, and a crew that had seen enough of the universe to not be surprised by much. Commander Cole Hargrove stood at the front of the bridge, both hands resting on the steel railing that curved around the main console. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself like someone who had made peace with dangerous things a long time ago. His hair was cut short and going gray at the sides. His eyes were dark and steady. He had spent 12 years in deep space and had been shot twice, broken his collarbone 3 times, and once survived 6 days on a frozen moon with nothing but emergency rations and a broken heater. He did not talk about any of this unless someone asked. Behind him, Dr. Nadia Flores sat at her station, a pair of thin glasses balanced on her nose, reading data on a glowing screen. She was the ship's chief xenobiologist, which meant it was her job to study life. Any kind of life, wherever they found it. She had a quiet way about her, but she was sharp, and she noticed things that other people missed. She had joined the mission specifically because she wanted to find something new. She did not know yet how much she was about to get. To her left, Owen Burke was lying halfway under a panel on the floor, his boots sticking out into the walkway. He was fixing a power coupling that had been flickering for 3 days. He hummed to himself while he worked, some old song nobody else recognized. Owen was the ship's propulsion engineer, and he treated the ship like it was a living thing that just needed the right attention. He had grease on his hands all the time and laughed easily. Near the back, Lena Garrett sat at the medical station reviewing routine health reports. She was the crew's combat medic, trained in field surgery, emergency response, and trauma care. She was calm by nature, the kind of person who did not raise her voice even when things were falling apart. Next to her, Danny Tran, the youngest member of the crew, was running diagnostics on the communications array. He was 24 years old and had been in deep space for less than a year. He still got excited about things which the older crew members found either charming or exhausting, depending on the day. The Ironclad Dawn had crossed into a region of space called the Veil Passage 3 days ago. It was a stretch of space thick with gas clouds and magnetic interference, and no human vessel had ever gone this deep into it before. Cole had read every available report on the area, which was not much. Mostly old long-range scans and a few theories. Nothing concrete. That was exactly the kind of place he liked. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, Danny's console lit up. "Contact," Danny said. His voice was calm, but his hands moved fast. "Multiple signals. Big ones." Cole walked over without hurrying and looked at the screen. The shapes forming on the scanner were large, much larger than the Ironclad Dawn. There were 7 of them, arranged in a loose formation, and they were moving toward the human ship with deliberate speed. "Are they responding to our presence?" Nadia asked, already standing and moving toward the front. "Yes," Danny said. "They adjusted course when we showed up on their sensors. They're coming to us." Nobody panicked. Cole straightened up, rolled his shoulders once, and said, "Open a channel. Standard greeting protocol. Let them hear us first." Danny sent the signal, a recorded message in a dozen mathematical patterns and frequency combinations, the kind of thing that had been designed by Earth's first contact teams 20 years ago. It was meant to say in every language at once that the ship coming toward you meant no harm and wanted to talk. For 11 minutes there was nothing. Then the screens filled with color and noise, and the translator system, still new, still imperfect, began to piece together something like a response. The aliens called themselves the Vreth. They were the leading species of something they called the Vreth Collective, a governing alliance of many civilizations spread across this part of the galaxy. They had been in space for thousands of years. Their tone, even filtered through the rough translation software, carried a kind of effortless authority. The tone of people who were used to being the most important ones in the room. Their ambassador's name came through the translator as Zine Orath. The image on the screen was difficult to read. A tall, thin figure with long limbs and skin that shifted color slightly when it moved, like oil on water. It looked at the humans with something close to curiosity. But the curiosity was distant, the way a person might look at an insect that had wandered onto their table. Zine Orath spoke in slow, measured tones. The translator caught maybe 60% of it. But the meaning was clear enough. Who are you? Where are you from? And what are you doing here? Cole answered directly. He told them the name of their ship, the name of their planet, and that they were here to explore. He did not exaggerate, did not perform, and did not seem nervous. He spoke the way he always spoke, plainly, like someone who had nothing to prove. There was a pause on the other end. Then the Vreth ambassador asked for permission to conduct a biological scan of the crew. It was presented as routine, a formality. Cole looked at Nadia, who gave a small nod. He agreed. The scan took 4 minutes. Nobody on the bridge said much during it. Danny watched his instruments. Owen climbed out from under the panel, wiped his hands, and looked at the alien ship on the screen with open curiosity. Lena leaned against her station and watched the data scroll across Zine Orath's side of the feed. On the Vreth vessel, there was a very different atmosphere. The bioscanner results came through, and the technician running the system stopped typing and stared at the screen. Then she ran the scan again. Then she called her supervisor over. The numbers were wrong, not in a broken equipment way, but in a this cannot be right way. The creatures on the small human ship had bone density levels that registered higher than most known species, twice their size. Their resting heart rate during an unknown contact situation was barely elevated. Their bodies carried hundreds of old injury markers, healed breaks, scar tissue, repaired damage, the kind of accumulation that usually meant a very hard life or a very dangerous world. Zine Orath reviewed the report quietly, then looked at the image of the human ship on the screen. Small, dull-colored, clearly not built for war. And yet, the ambassador filed the scan under routine new contact and moved on. There were diplomatic procedures to follow, and the collective had met strange species before. These humans were probably just another young civilization taking their first steps. A little unusual, perhaps. Worth watching, maybe. Nothing to worry about. On the bridge of the ironclad Dawn, Cole turned to the crew and said, "Looks like we made friends. Let's not embarrass ourselves." Owen laughed. Danny started typing notes into his log. Nadia was already reading everything the translator had caught, her pen moving fast across her notebook. The first meeting was over, but it was only the beginning. E was a junior scientist in the Vreth Collective's Biological Records Division, and his work was mostly dull. New species came through the contact channels every few decades, and his job was to take the scan data, run it through the classification system, file it under the correct category, and move on. It was not exciting work. Most new species turned out to be simple: soft bodies, limited environmental range, nervous dispositions. They fit into the existing categories without much trouble, and the files closed quickly. The human file did not close quickly. Sith Varan had been staring at the data for 2 hours when he finally admitted to himself that something was wrong with it. Not wrong in the way that equipment malfunctioned, wrong in the way that a number didn't belong in the column it was sitting in. The biological readings from the small human crew were consistent across all 11 individuals. And if it wasn't a glitch, then what he was looking at was real. He started with the basics. The humans came from a single planet. One world, one moon, one star. Nothing unusual there. He pulled up the planetary record and let the system run its standard hazard classification. He watched the score climb as the data loaded. Tectonic activity, severe. Atmospheric instability, high. Temperature range across the surface, extreme. Gravitational pull, significantly above the galactic average for inhabited worlds. Predatory fauna density, very high. Pathogen ecosystem complexity, off the upper end of the standard scale. The system finished loading and displayed the result. Class 7 Deathworld. Sith Varan sat back in his chair. In the entire recorded history of the Vreth Collective, spanning more than 4,000 years of galactic exploration and contact with over 300 intelligent species, not one sentient civilization had ever been found on a world classified above Class 4. Class 4 worlds were already considered extreme. They were the kind of planets that other species visited in sealed suits with armed escorts and emergency evacuation plans. A Class 5 world was considered broadly uninhabitable for most known life. Class 6 was where the Collective's hazard teams refused to land without direct Council authorization. Class 7 had no protocols, because nothing was supposed to live there. And yet, Sith Varan pulled up the crew scan data again, and looked at it with new eyes. The bone density that had confused the scanning technician made sense now. It was the result of generations of evolution under heavier gravity. Bodies building themselves denser and stronger just to stand upright on that world. The elevated pain tolerance scores that had seemed like a sensor error were real. The immune system complexity, the way human bodies carried antibodies and biological countermeasures for dozens of pathogens simultaneously, was the natural result of living alongside a microbial ecosystem that was constantly trying to kill them. But what made Sith Varan truly pause was what he found when he started pulling cultural records. The Collective's contact team had gathered a small amount of material during the initial exchange: digital transmissions, some image files, fragments of historical data. Sith Varan went through it carefully, building a picture piece by piece. Humans ran, not because something was chasing them, they ran for pleasure. They went to the tops of their world's highest and most dangerous mountains, not because they needed to, but because the mountain was there. They had, at an early stage of their development, looked at the large predators sharing their world, animals with claws, teeth, venom, and size advantages over the small early humans, and decided to make some of them into companions, pets, family members. They had taken the most dangerous animals on their planet and taught them to sleep next to their children. They had also, Sith Varan noted with quiet discomfort, spent a very large portion of their history fighting each other, and had developed, through that long and brutal process, a staggering variety of ways to do it. And then, somehow, they had stepped back from most of it, built systems of cooperation, launched themselves into space, and arrived in the Veil Passage, looking genuinely happy to meet someone new. He sat with all of this for a long time. Then he wrote it up and sent it to Ambassador Xenorath. The ambassador read the report in the evening, in the quiet of his private chamber. He was not an excitable creature by nature. He had been in diplomatic service for 60 years, and had seen things that would make younger Vreth go pale. But he read Sith Varan's report twice, then a third time, and by the end, he was sitting very still. The Collective had met the humans with the comfortable assumption that they were dealing with something young and small and manageable. A new species in the early stages of space travel. Curious, perhaps, a little rough around the edges, but nothing that required any serious adjustment to the usual procedures. The usual procedures, Xenorath now understood, had been designed for species that evolved on calm worlds. Species that grew up in safety and moved carefully because the universe was large and frightening and they were fragile. Those species arrived at first contact, nervous. They were easy to read. They wanted reassurance. They fit into the Collective's frameworks, the way water fits into a cup. The humans had not been nervous. They had been curious. Xenorath pulled up the recording of the first contact exchange and watched Cole Hargrove answer his questions. He watched the man's breathing, his posture, the steadiness of his voice. He watched the young one, Danny, running his instruments with focused energy, like someone who was enjoying himself. He watched the woman in the back, the medic, standing relaxed against her station, watching the alien feed on the screen the way a person watched something interesting on a quiet afternoon. None of them had been afraid. Xenorath filed that thought somewhere deep and careful in his mind. Meanwhile, on the ironclad Dawn, the crew was having dinner. Owen's hand was wrapped in a splint. He had caught it between two pieces of equipment during a maintenance job that afternoon. A bad angle, a sudden jolt, and 2 fingers had cracked. Lena had set them in about 10 minutes, taped them properly, and told him to stop using that hand for 3 days. Owen had nodded, and then immediately picked up his fork with the injured hand out of habit. And Lena had looked at him the way she always looked at him when he did something like this. "I'll use the other one," he said. "You said that last time," she said. Cole watched this from across the table and said nothing. Danny was talking about the Vreth color-shifting skin and whether it was emotional signaling or temperature regulation. Nadia was taking notes on a small pad next to her plate, not because she was working, but because she thought better when she wrote things down. It was an ordinary evening. Nobody talked about the fact that they were the first humans this deep in the galaxy, surrounded by alien ships on the edge of everything known. It simply was what it was. Tomorrow, there would be more contact sessions, more data to collect, more things to figure out. That was the job, and they were good at it. Nar Station was not a beautiful place, but it was a busy one. It sat at the far edge of the Veil Passage like a rusted nail hammered into the dark. A wide, spinning ring of metal and pressurized corridors, home to traders, diplomats, scientists, and workers from 6 different species. The Vreth ran it. The Ka'ul used it most. The Sarathi had a pressurized section near the top ring where they kept their atmospheric chambers. The Dalmari ambassador rarely left his quarters, but sent long written messages to everyone. It smelled, in the human sections at least, like recycled air and machine oil, and Cole Hargrove had decided after the first week that it felt almost comfortable. The ironclad Dawn had been docked at Nar Station for 3 weeks. The collective had extended a cautious invitation, not quite a welcome, but not a refusal either. The humans were allowed to stay, observe, participate in limited diplomatic sessions, and move through the public areas of the station. They were being watched constantly, though the Vreth were polite enough to pretend otherwise. Cole knew they were being watched. He didn't mind. He watched back. Things had been going slowly but steadily. Nadia had started an informal exchange of biological notes with Sith Varan, who had introduced himself with obvious nervousness, and then relaxed slightly when she treated him like a colleague rather than an alien. Danny had found a group of young Ka'ul workers on the lower level who were curious about the humans and asked a lot of questions. Lena kept the crew healthy and read in her quarters during off hours. Owen fixed things, on their own ship and twice on station equipment that had been giving the maintenance crew trouble. He had not been asked to do this. He had simply seen a problem and fixed it. The Vreth maintenance chief had not known what to say about that. It was on a Tuesday, by Earth's calendar, that everything changed. The alarm came just after the midday meal. Not a station-wide alarm, but a sharp, urgent signal from the lower decks. The kind that meant something had already gone wrong before anyone had time to warn anyone else. Cole was at the diplomatic briefing table when it happened. He stood up immediately and looked at the Vreth officer in the room, a young one named Tevsal, who handled station security communications. Tevsal's skin had gone pale, which in Vreth biology meant genuine fear. The report came in fast. A group of Ka'ul separatists, calling themselves the Hollow Choir, had taken the lower deck by force. They had moved quickly, sealed the corridor access points, and were now holding 43 hostages from 4 different species in the main cargo bay. They wanted the collective to formally recognize their independence claim. They had given a deadline of 6 hours. The Vreth security commander, a veteran named Orath Dus, took the briefing room. He was experienced and serious and clearly competent, but in the next 40 minutes, Cole watched him and his team go in circles. Their security forces were trained for ship combat and border enforcement. A hostage situation inside a pressurized civilian station, with multiple species in the hostage group and an unknown number of armed insurgents, was not something their doctrine covered well. Every plan they proposed had a problem. The corridors were narrow. The cargo bay had 3 entry points. The Sarathi hostages could not survive a pressurized breach. The Dalmari hostage was already showing signs of stress collapse. 40 minutes. No plan. Cole listened to all of it. Then he looked at Lena, who was standing near the wall with her medkit on her shoulder. Then he looked at Owen, who had come up from the lower deck when the alarm sounded, and was now leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, already knowing what was coming. Cole said quietly, "Let's go take a look." Ted Saul stepped forward. "Commander Hargrove, our security team is handling." "I know," Cole said. "We're just going to look." They walked out before anyone could stop them. What happened over the next 2 hours was recorded on 14 different security feeds across the station. Sith Varen would later obtain copies of all 14 and watch them more times than he would admit. Cole, Lena, and Owen moved through the lower corridors with a calm that looked, to alien eyes, almost wrong. There was no hesitation in their steps. They spoke to each other in short, quiet sentences, not whispers, just efficient. When they reached the first sealed access point, Owen looked at the lock mechanism for about 20 seconds, and then bypassed it using a tool from his belt, and knowledge he had picked up fixing Vreth station equipment 2 weeks earlier. The door opened. They went through. The hollow choir had 3 armed members in the outer corridor. Cole walked toward them with his hands visible, and his pace unhurried. The kind of walk that said, "I am not running because there is no reason to run." The lead insurgent raised his weapon. Cole stopped at a distance that was closer than it should have been, and he talked. The translator feed caught most of it. He did not threaten. He did not argue. He spoke in a tone that was level and direct, and somehow made the space in the corridor feel smaller, more contained, like the conversation was the only thing that existed, and everything else could wait. He asked the insurgent his name. He said he understood that the hollow choir had been ignored for a long time, and that feeling invisible was a real thing. He said that the hostages in the next room had nothing to do with that, and that letting them go would not cost the insurgent anything he actually wanted. It took 11 minutes. The insurgent lowered his weapon. The other 2 looked at each other. Then they lowered theirs. Owen moved past them toward the cargo bay door. Lena was already pulling on gloves. Inside the cargo bay, 12 of the hostages needed medical attention. Lena worked through them methodically. A gash on a Vreth worker's arm. A Ka'ul youth with a dislocated shoulder. A Sarathi diplomat whose atmospheric regulator had been damaged and was breathing in short, panicked bursts. Lena fixed the regulator first. She had never worked on Sarathi equipment before. She figured it out in 4 minutes. She had a cut on her own forearm from a piece of broken casing near the entrance. She did not mention it. When a young Kaul hostage pointed at it with wide eyes, she looked down, said, "Oh," wrapped it with a strip of cloth from their kit, and went back to work. When Cole walked back into the briefing room an hour and 50 minutes after he had left, his left arm was in a makeshift sling. He had caught a glancing blow from a falling storage unit near the end, and he was looking around for something to eat. The Vreth security team was silent. Orath Dus stared at him for a long moment, and then said, through the translator, "How?" Cole considered the question seriously. the way he always considered things seriously, and talked to people like they're people. Then he found a ration bar in his jacket pocket and ate it, while Tevsal stared at him like he had just watched something he did not have a word for. Sithvaran, watching the security feeds from his station 3 levels up, opened a new document on his screen and began to type. He had a feeling this was going to be a long report. The council chamber at the heart of Nar Station was not used often. It was a wide circular room with high ceilings and seats arranged in tiered rings, built to hold representatives from every species in the collective at once. The lighting was soft and adjustable, because several species needed different conditions to think clearly. The air mix was carefully managed. It was, in every practical sense, a room designed for very serious conversations. It had not been used in 11 months. It was used now. Xenorath called the emergency session the morning after the hostage situation. The invitation went to every senior representative on the station, and the subject line, as translated by the collective's communication system, read simply, "The humans." Every seat was filled within the hour. Xenorath stood at the center and did not waste time. He presented Sistvaran's full report, not the summary version he had read quietly in his chamber, but the complete document, with all the data, all the planetary hazard classifications, all the biological scan results, all the cultural notes. He put it in front of the council in its entirety and let them read it. The room was quiet for a long time. Elder Moonparath spoke first. She was the oldest Dolmari on the station, ancient even by Dolmari standards, with a body that moved slowly, and eyes that had seen 4 centuries of the collective's history. When she spoke, people listened, not out of obligation, but because she had earned it. She said that the data before them needed to be understood clearly, not reacted to quickly. She said that what the report described was not a threat in the way the council feared. It was something different. It was a species that had been built over millions of years by a world that never made anything easy. Every hard thing on that planet had pushed its creatures toward either death or adaptation, and the humans had chosen adaptation every single time. Not once or twice, but generation after generation, in every climate, against every danger, until they were something that a calm and comfortable galaxy had simply never had a reason to produce. She said, the question was never whether they were dangerous. The question was what they did with what they were. A Cowl representative near the back, a senior officer named Thrall Ven, pushed back on this. He said that the biological data alone was enough to justify concern. A species with that level of physical endurance, pain resistance, and historical aggression was a security consideration regardless of their current intentions. The fact that 3 of them had walked into a hostage situation and resolved it in under 2 hours without collective authorization was not reassuring. It raised questions about control, about boundaries, about what would happen when a species like this decided it wanted something the collective wasn't offering. Several members murmured agreement. Xenorath let the debate run for a while. Then he did something unexpected. He asked for Nadia Flores to be brought into the chamber. Nadia had known the session was happening. Cole had told her that morning, very calmly, that the council was meeting about them, and that it would probably be fine, and that she should be honest if they asked her anything. She had nodded and gone back to her notes. When the invitation came, she put her notebook in her jacket pocket and walked to the chamber alone. She stood at the center of the room, where Xenorath had stood, surrounded by representatives of 43 species, all of them looking at her, and she looked back at them with an expression that was attentive and patient and not particularly worried. Xenorath asked her, through the translator, a question that the whole council had agreed upon. Why had the humans not disclosed the nature of their world when first contact was made? She thought about this for a moment, not because she was stalling, but because she was trying to find the right words. Then, she said that nobody had asked, and that even if they had, she was not sure what they would have said differently. Earth was their home. They had grown up there. To them it was just home. It was where the sky turned colors at sunset, and where it rained, and where things grew. Yes, there were dangerous animals. Yes, the weather could be violent. Yes, the ground sometimes shook. That was just what a planet was. She had never thought to describe it as extreme, because she had no other planet to compare it to, growing up. It was simply the world she came from. The chamber was very quiet. A Sarathi representative asked, through the translation layer, whether humans were afraid of anything. Nadia smiled a little at that. She said yes, of course. Humans were afraid of plenty of things. They were afraid of losing people they loved. They were afraid of failing at things that mattered. They were afraid of the dark sometimes still, even as adults. She said this without embarrassment, as a simple fact. They felt fear the same as anyone. They just moved through it. Because on a world like Earth, if you stopped every time you were afraid, you would never move at all. So, the fear became something you carried with you, while you did the thing anyway. Elder Moon Parath was quiet for a moment after this. Then she said softly to the room, rather than to Nadia, that this was perhaps the most important sentence anyone had said in this chamber in a very long time. The debate continued after Nadia left. Thralden and his supporters were not fully satisfied, and their concerns were not unreasonable. The council acknowledged that. A species with humanity's characteristics entering the collective space was a new variable in an old system, and new variables needed to be understood carefully. But the argument for quarantine lost ground slowly throughout the session. Not because anyone dismissed the concerns, but because the evidence kept pointing in a direction that was harder to argue with. The humans had been on the station for 3 weeks. They had fixed equipment that wasn't theirs to fix because they saw it needed fixing. They had made friends with young workers on the lower deck. Their medic had treated Sarathi hostages with equipment she had never trained on. Their commander had stopped an armed standoff by talking, and the one thing every translation analyst agreed on was that he had meant every word he said. Sif Varan was not a council member and was not in the chamber, but he had submitted a written addendum to his report that Xenorath read aloud near the end of the session. It was a single paragraph. It said that in his research he had found that human history was full of darkness, wars, cruelty, suffering they had caused each other across centuries. He was not dismissing that, but what he found most significant was that alongside all of that, humans had also produced from the same world, the same biology, the same difficult history, people who ran toward strangers in trouble, who sat with the dying, who taught their children to be kind. The capacity for both things lived in the same creature. And in his professional assessment, the side of that creature currently sitting at their table was the one worth knowing. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. The collective would open formal dialogue with humanity. Xenorath sat alone in the chamber after everyone had left. The lights had dimmed to their lowest setting. He looked at the empty seat where Nadia had stood and thought about what she had said about fear, about carrying it while you moved anyway. He thought that was probably the bravest and strangest thing he had ever heard. And he thought, not for the first time, that the galaxy had been a great deal simpler before the ironclad dawn came through the Veil Passage. But simpler, he admitted quietly to himself, was not always the same as better. 6 months after the ironclad dawn first drifted into the Veil Passage, the view from Nar Station's observation deck had changed considerably. There were now 3 human ships docked at the station. The ironclad dawn was still there, older and more familiar now, its hull a little more scuffed from 6 months of deep space wear. Beside it sat the Pale Meridian, a sleek Explorer-class vessel commanded by Captain Grace Okafor. A tall, quiet woman from Atlanta, who had spent 15 years mapping uninhabited star systems, and who approached diplomacy the same way she approached navigation, steadily, without panic, and always with a backup plan. The third ship was a civilian science vessel called the Threshold, smaller than the other two, crewed by researchers and specialists, including xenolinguist Dr. Silliman. Aaron Voss, a wiry man from New Mexico who could learn the basic structure of a new language in under a week, and materials engineer Becca Lund, who had grown up in Minnesota and had the particular stubbornness of someone used to dealing with winters that lasted 6 months. The station had changed too. Not physically. The corridors were the same narrow metal tubes. The air recyclers still hummed at the same frequency. The lights in the Kahul section were still too dim for human eyes. But the feeling of the place was different. There was more movement between sections now. More cross-species conversations in the common areas. A small food exchange had started informally near the mid-level market, where a Vreth cook had become deeply interested in human spice combinations. And Owen had eaten something the Kahul workers prepared for him that he could not identify, but described as surprisingly great. The collective had formally opened dialogue with humanity 4 months ago. It was not a simple process. There were long sessions and complicated translation problems, and at least 3 occasions where something said through the translator came out entirely wrong and had to be carefully walked back. Grace Okafor handled most of the formal sessions with a patience that impressed even the veteran Vreth diplomats. She never raised her voice. She never seemed frustrated, even during the longest and most circular discussions. When Thrall Ven, the Kahul security officer who had argued most strongly against humanity's inclusion, pushed back hard during a resource-sharing session, Grace had simply looked at him, asked what outcome he actually wanted, and then found a way to build toward it without making him feel like he had lost. Thrall Ven had not thanked her, but he had stopped arguing against the dialogue process entirely after that session, which everyone recognized as the closest thing to approval he was capable of giving. Aaron Voss had made the most unexpected progress. He had spent his first 2 months on the station doing what he always did, listening more than talking, building vocabulary, learning the way different species constructed meaning. He had an informal way about him that made people relax. The Kahul workers who played cards with Danny in the evenings had started including Aaron in their conversations, not because he was a diplomat, but because he was genuinely interested in what they were saying and asked good questions. He had learned enough of their dialect to make jokes in it, which had produced a reaction from the Kahul that no human had seen before, a kind of rapid, full-body shimmer that turned out to be laughter. He had written a 12-page note about it that he sent to Nadia with 3 exclamation points in the subject line, which was very unlike him. Becca Lund had spent most of her time in the engineering sections. She had a practical mind and little patience for politics, and she found the collective's technical infrastructure fascinating in the way that someone who genuinely loved materials and systems would find any sufficiently complex engineering project fascinating. She had identified, without being asked, 17 structural inefficiencies in the station's power distribution network, and written them up in a clear document that she handed to the Vreth maintenance chief one morning with a cup of something hot that approximated coffee. The maintenance chief had read it, implemented 8 of the suggestions within a week, and told Xenorath privately that the human engineers were either very generous or showing off. Xenorath had said it was probably both, and that either way, the result was the same. Cole Hargrove spent the 6 months the way he spent most things, steadily and without a lot of noise. He attended the formal sessions when he needed to, stepped back when Grace was leading, and spent a significant amount of his free time sitting with Elder Moon Parath in her quarters, drinking the warm liquid she preferred in the evenings, and listening to her talk about the collective's history. She was 400 years old, and had watched the galaxy change in ways that still surprised her. She said that in all her years, She had never seen a first-contact situation move as fast as this one. Not fast in the diplomatic sense, but fast in the human sense, meaning the humans had simply started behaving like they belonged, before anyone had officially decided whether they did. Cole had thought about that for a while, and then said he supposed that was just how people were when they were comfortable somewhere. Moon Parath had asked him if humans were comfortable here. He had looked around her small, warm quarters, at the shelves of old Dolmari records, at the soft light, at the stars visible through the narrow window, and said yes, actually, he thought they were. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said that was good. That a species that could be comfortable far from home was a species that could be trusted with a large home. It was Sith Varan who wrote the document that would be remembered longest. He had been working on it for months, quietly, between his regular research duties. It was not an official report. It was not filed through any formal channel. It was simply something he had felt needed to be written. He called it a record, a first-person account of everything he had observed and learned and thought since the day he opened the human biological file and found numbers that didn't fit the columns they were in. He wrote about Earth. He wrote about the scans and the classification and the long process of understanding what a Class 7 world actually meant for the creature it produced. He wrote about the card games, and the broken hand, and the hostage situation, and the council session, and Nadia's answer about fear. He wrote about Grace Okafor, and the way she listened. He wrote about Aaron Voss learning to make Ka'ul workers laugh. He wrote about Becca Lund handing over a document of infrastructure improvements like it was nothing. He wrote about Cole sitting with Moon Parath in the evenings. And at the end, he wrote the sentence that he had been circling around for 6 months without knowing how to say it. He wrote it simply, in plain language, because he had spent enough time around humans to know that plain language was often the most honest kind. He wrote, "We did not know what a Deathworlder was until one looked us in the eye, set down its weapons, and asked if we were all right." He sent the document to Zine Orath first, then to Moon Parath, then, after a moment of hesitation, to Nadia Flores, because she was the one who had first treated him like a colleague and not a curiosity, and he thought she should read it. Nadia read it at her desk on the ironclad Dawn, late in the evening, when the ship was quiet. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the stars through her small porthole window for a long time. Then she went to find Cole, because some things needed to be shared. He was in the common room, drinking coffee, reading a report. He looked up when she came in. She handed him her screen without saying anything. He read Sith Varan's last line. Then he set the screen down and looked at the table for a moment. "Huh," he said, quietly. Then he picked up his coffee and looked out the window, at the station, at the alien ships docked beside theirs, at the distant light of stars that humans were only just beginning to learn the names of. Outside, the galaxy was large and old, and full of things that had been there long before humanity arrived. But the ironclad Dawn was docked at a station in the middle of it, and inside that station, a Vreth cook was trying to figure out black pepper, and a Ka'ul worker was learning to bluff at cards, and a 400-year-old Dalmari elder was writing a letter to the collective council that began with the words, "It is time we made some room." The Deathworlders had arrived. And somehow, against all reasonable expectation, they had made themselves at home.